Hello, everybody. Welcome to the History Valley podcast with your host, Jacob Berman. Today, I'm joined by Timothy Freke. One of the things that he's most well known for is his book, The Jesus Mysteries.
People don't seem to take enough notice of is the intertestamental texts, as they're called, which is a whole load of texts written between when we think some of the what we call the Old Testament texts were written and what we call the New Testament texts were written. And these texts are just dismissed because they're not in the canon. But there's a whole range of texts, and they all combine Jewish and pagan mythology.
When do you think that this process started? The Christian process, that is, when
Christianity? Well,
Jesus.
I suspect it's a few hundred years BC is when it's starting. And it really takes off maybe 50 BC or maybe a bit earlier. And you start getting these crossovers, and it will then keep going for the next 100 years or so until we get the stories that we're familiar with now, which I think have been cobbled together from all sorts of different sources. But not, this is the thing that people often misunderstand, I think. They kind of think it's some sort of conspiracy or done malevolently. Now, I think probably, you know, once it becomes politicized, but that's way in the future, that's when it gets into the hands of the Romans, then maybe there is some degree of politicization and corruption and all the rest of it. But basically, it's not. I mean, basically, it's people of goodwill developing this incredible Gnostic fantasy, which is so powerful and contains such amazing ideas. It still resonates with us today. I think the Gnostics are the original Christians. The Gnostics are practicing the Jesus mysteries. They are practicing a mystery school. They speak in the language of the Greek mysteries. And they are developing a strand of Jewish paganism, and it will later become literalized. Therefore, the early documents, for me, they're all Gnostic, and they're encoding allegories that lead to Gnosis. And the reason that it's probably started much, much earlier than people normally think, because we get mesmerized by this illusory year zero. Once you lose the year zero, you're free then to go, okay, so wonder when it did start. So instead, you see this developing organic schools of Jewish Gnosticism. And at the center of this Jewish Gnosticism is the figure of Joshua, in the Greek, Jesus, who is the Messiah. And the Messiah is the person who's going to lead you to the Gnosis. And that is fermenting away in all these different forms. And just like today, they all disagree with each other. And another group will come out of this eventually, which have got a different take. And their take is, it actually happened. This actually is a history. All the others are just myths. And this is a brand new idea, and it makes it very attractive. And it has an appeal, and it takes off. And then for various quirks of history, that gets taken up eventually by the Roman Empire, and that becomes the Christianity. It's only now, gradually over the last 300-400 years, that we've been able to unpick all of this and go back and go, oh, hang on, was that what really happened? I don't think it is.
One of the differences between the Gnostics and the Christians is that the Christians, they accept the Jewish God, Yahweh. They think that he's Jesus' father. But the Gnostics, they reject Yahweh.
Yep.
Since you think the Gnostics came first, what do you think the Christian rejection of that idea, and what do they revise their religion to incorporate Yahweh back in as the benevolent deity?
I think that's an absolutely fascinating question, Jacob, because it's obviously not a very easy thing to do, because Yahweh isn't a benevolent deity by any stretch of the imagination, and you've only got to read the text, and that's as clear as day. He's a tribal thunder god, you know, a jealous deity fighting off other deities. And the God of the Gnostic Christians is much more like Plato's God. It's much more the one. It's love. It's a revolution, and it's a huge leap forward. So it can take the message, which has been developing in pagan thought, and really this message of love is quite extraordinary, I think, and forgiveness, and just beautiful. Very hard to tie with Yahweh. So a hell of a job to get it back to that God. I think it served a purpose, because what it enables you to do politically is it enables you to justify anything, because everything's in the book. So if you want to encourage forgiveness, there's lots of lovely forgiveness stuff. But if you want to encourage vengeance and violence, there's plenty of violence to call on as well. And I think part of the success of Roman Christianity was that built-in ambivalence, that it could draw on whatever it wanted. And so I think that's why it was successful. I think also there was a kind of a thing in the ancient world as well, which may have been important, which was the idea of tradition, that it was old and it went back. And so being able to claim this ancient lineage gave it some foundation. The other element which should not be underestimated, the Jesus myth does draw on Jewish mythology. It's not paganism, it's a hybrid. And so it is linked to the story of Genesis. It's very much, Jesus is coming to redeem the story of Genesis. And so you kind of need some of that in order to make sense of the Jesus story. So I think that's the other element that made people want to hang on to it.
Do you think Old Testament texts like the census of David, because there's two versions of it. There's one version that says God ordered the census, then he gets mad and kills like, how many? I think 3,000. And then a later version says it was Satan that caused it. Do you think Gnostics could have noticed that contradiction?
Yeah, I think that's very likely. They're really trying to explain suffering and how to escape it, same as the Buddhist tradition. They're trying to explain why you're trapped in a world of suffering and how the hell you can get out. And the gnosis, or the awakening, depending on which word you want to use, or the gnana, in the East, it's the same word, is the route out. And you know something, and what you know is the thing which transcends it all. And you know God. And if you can know that, then you will be free. That's what they're fundamentally offering. And then and that's what's so important. The book that I really enjoyed writing the most with Peter was Jesus and the Lost Goddess, which was the second book after the Jesus mystery. We went, okay, so if this is an evolutionary myth, this is an evolution of a mythos, why was it so important? Why tell this story in different ways over and over and over? And why did it develop such richness? They think it's an allegory. They think it's a teaching story. The whole Jesus story is a parable. It's a teaching story. And like the Good Samaritan, looking for the historical basis of it is a complete waste of time. What matters is, what's it a parable about? Why was it important? And so in Jesus and the Lost Goddess, because the Gnostics also didn't just take the story of the father and the son, they also took the story of the mother and the daughter from paganism. They had a quaternity. And looking at what was the Jesus allegory, and the allegory of Jesus and the goddess, what was that allegory about? And I think it's very profound. I think there's a lot in there that's worth bringing out, which we lost when we literalized it. Because at that point, it became about believing history instead of understanding the allegory. Although, having said that, of course, you can go to literalist churches across the world on any Sunday and you will hear them all draw it out as if it's an allegory. So, Jesus turned water into wine at a wedding. And what this means for us is our everyday lives can be transformed into the joy and ecstasy of wine. So they can't help themselves, because that's what it's designed for. And that's when it has some meaning. Otherwise, it's just something that somebody else did a long time ago, and that's not much use to you. What we can see in the ancient mysteries, the pagan mysteries, is you have the outer mysteries and the inner mysteries. The outer mysteries is when you hear the stories, and the inner mysteries is when you're told what they mean. And I think the Gnostics have clearly got that. And then what we inherited as the Roman Church lost that, just had the outer mysteries. It lost the inner mysteries. So no one ever took you to one side when you were old enough and went, okay, actually, this is about you. It's about you experiencing God, which is gnosis of God. That's the journey you're on. No one did that. They just told you had to believe it because it's the story. And that was what we lost. But those inner and outer mysteries were the currency of ancient spirituality. That's what the mystery schools were about. And you can still see that in people like Clement of Alexandria, for instance, where he's constantly talking about them as allegories and trying to understand the allegorical meaning of the story. And Irenaeus talks about, and when he's attacking the Gnostics, of each one of them is not seen as initiated until they've written their own myth, which is a fascinating thing to say, and suggests this idea again that, this is an allegory. and you need to understand it. And the way you understand it is you create your own mythos of some type. And so there's so many of them, but so then it's like you can see it as a very creative thing. And that's what we did I mentioned Jesus and the Lost Goddess. That's what we did in that book. We just go right into it and go, look, this is what the story means. And that's when it comes to life. And for me, that's the most convincing bit of the whole, the argument, which we can't go into, but, you're well aware. It's like, oh, well, there's no historical evidence for Jesus, so that's gone. And there's all of these similarities with paganism, so that needs explaining. And then you've got this group, the Gnostics, and they understand the Gospels allegorically. So it's like the simplest parsimonious explanation is it's another one. There's all these other pagan groups who are doing it. It's a Jewish group doing it. It's a simple explanation. And then when you go into it and you go, oh, look, this seems to be what it's saying. And you can take, why is there 12 disciples? Okay, no, that's the 12 signs of the zodiac. You've got Jesus in the middle, leading round dances in one of the Gnostic Gospels. So the disciples are the 12 states of being on the wheel, which is the movement of the stars. And you need to find the still point, which is the pole star, which is the Christ. And that's in you. You find the still point in yourself, which doesn't move, which doesn't change, which is your divine essence. From little things like that right the way through to the motif of death and rebirth, there is symbolic meaning in all of these little stories, which is why they're in there, because each one is a little parable that someone will unpack and go, so this is what it means. The myth is like a spiritual textbook, which you can then take all the different chapters from and go, oh, that's what it's about.
Well, thank you for joining me. It's been a wonderful discussion.
Good evening and welcome to Talk Gnosis. I'm Bishop Lainey Peterson. My normal co-host, Bishop Ken Canterbury, can't be with us tonight. And I want to welcome, we have a very special guest this evening, Mr. Tim Freke.
The whole of the Jesus myth is about how we can save the soul from being lost and bring it back to the Christ. It's so rich once you see what these teachings really are. It's kind of liberating. I find it immensely liberating because the myth is so deep.
Right. Yes, it is. I think it was Father Tony, actually, who brought this topic up one evening, and he asked Bishop Ken, my co-host, and I, would we bail on the church if Jesus was proven to be a myth? And we both said no. For us, there's far more to this than the historical person.
One of the things I love about the Gnostics, is, and we certainly get that in their text, where Jesus is one beautiful text where Jesus appears as a baby, then an old man, then a youth. And then there's this lovely line which says, and some saw him and realized they were seeing their own self. And there you're just like, whoa, that's it. That's it. For them, the good news, the gospel, is the gnosis.
Yes.
The good news is you can experience gnosis of God. You can know who you are. You can experience agape. This is the good news. And the Jesus story is a vehicle to that.
It absolutely is. And that's wonderful. Thank you.
Welcome to another Law of Attraction Talk Radio segment here. I'm Julie, and I am so excited to bring you Mr. Timothy Freke, this incredible philosopher. I wanted to start off right away talking about your book that you co-authored with Peter Gandy, The Jesus Mysteries, where you suggest that Jesus is a mythical figure. Can we talk a little bit about this?
Yes, sure, Julie. I mean, this is the thing that really brought my work to the public attention, because I guess it's pretty controversial. But, it doesn't seem that way to me anymore. I wrote this with a good friend of mine, Peter Gandy, who's a classicist, and we were actually not investigating Christianity at all. We were looking at the early Christians called Gnostics and paganism, when it became obvious to us that we were dealing with a completely new idea about the origins of Christianity. So the conclusion we've come to, and I urge people not to believe me, because when people just believe me, that's where we end up in trouble. When people just believe things they hear, we need to check it out. So if you're interested, I think people should check the book, because in the book we give everything, these footnotes, and we state the evidence very clearly. But let me just state to you the conclusion, which is where we've ended up, which is this. The Jesus story, if you look at it, you stand back from it, it sounds like a myth. It's a story of a man born of a virgin, walks on water, comes back from the dead. And that's because it is a myth. It contains lots of little parables, doesn't it? Like they're teaching stories. They're not meant to be taken literally. There isn't literally a Good Samaritan. It's a teaching story. And the whole of the Jesus story is a teaching story, which conveys the teachings which lead to this state which the Gnostic Christians, who I think are the original Christians, the state they called Gnosis, which is this state of waking up to oneness and unconditional love. And the whole of the story is an allegory in which Jesus is an everyman figure who represents each one of us. And in creating this story, these early Gnostic Christians, the people who actually made this allegory, they weren't doing anything new. They were actually doing something that human beings have been doing for hundreds, probably thousands of years. Because throughout the ancient Mediterranean, at that time, they had been telling stories of a son of God who dies and resurrects, comes back to life. And in Egypt, he's Osiris, and in Greece he becomes Dionysus, and in Persia he becomes Mithras, elsewhere he's Serapis, Adonis, Attis, and amongst a small group of expat Jews living in Alexandria, we suggest, he becomes Jesus, or Joshua in the Hebrew, but in the Greek it's Jesus. Because what they've done is they've taken little elements from all the stories of the other pagan God-man and put them together into a new form. So if I just give you a list now, because it's quite impressive when you hear it, these are all things that are said about the pagan God-man. Not Jesus, the pagan God-man. The pagan God-man is a son of God, born of a virgin on the 25th of December in a cave or sometimes in a stable before shepherds. He has 12 disciples, he does miracles, he changes water into wine at a wedding, right the way through to the important stuff. He dies at Easter, sometimes through crucifixion.
You're kidding. All of this?
Through crucifixion. The cover of our book, The Jesus Mysteries, has a picture of a figure looks like Jesus. It's not. It's this pagan dying and resurrecting God-man. He comes back after 3 days and then ascends to heaven. And if you want to commune with him, you take bread and wine symbolizing his body and blood.
Wow.
All of that pre-exists Christianity. And that's why we've come to the conclusion that Jesus' story is a myth. More than that, it's a pagan myth which has been rewritten, and it encodes these teachings of Gnosis.
Wow. Incredible. But you stated in another interview that doing this book actually brought you closer to realizing the Christ consciousness.
It was a revelation for me because, we're not here to rubbish anything. What this does, I feel, is actually open up what Christianity was really all about. You see, we've inherited a Christianity which is about believing something happened in history. If you believe an historical event happened, Jesus' death and resurrection, then you'll go to heaven when you die. And if you don't, well, according to some, you'll go to hell when you die and get tortured forever by a God of love,
right.
Which always disturbed me greatly. But for the Gnostic Christians, it's not like that at all. For the Gnostic Christians, the purpose of the Jesus story is to reveal what they called the Christ within. And the Christ within is our essence, our real essential nature. So what they say is we've got two natures. We have what they call the eidolon, which means an image, and the daemon, which means our spirit. So the image is what we appear to be. I appear to be Tim on the end of this phone talking to you. Mm-hmm. And we appear in this story of life and we're separate. But if we pay attention to our being, if we pay attention to that presence that each one of us calls I, then it's possible to enter a deep state of communion in which we see that actually we're one with everything. There's one awareness within which the whole of life is arising right now. And that's what they call the Christ within. And the whole purpose of Christianity wasn't for you to believe in something in history. It was to discover the Christ within yourself and enter this state of awakening.
Wow.
Now, having discovered that, suddenly Christianity, for me, had a whole load more depth than I ever thought it had.
Welcome to the Alcove. I'm Mark Malero. My guest today is the world mysticism author Timothy Freke. His previous books include the controversial best-selling book, The Jesus Mysteries. His new book is entitled The Gospel of the Second Coming. Are there historians, though, that would disagree with you, though, that aren't, let's say, religiously inclined, that just believe that there was a person named Jesus at that time, whether or not that was a Messiah or not? That there might have been
it's kind of like a black hole. Albert Schweitzer, who did all of this years before us and came to the conclusion there was no historical Jesus, said it was like looking into a well. You just saw, there was nothing there, so you just saw your own face reflected back. And, it's like that. Everyone has their own Jesus. Buddhists have a Buddha Jesus. Hindus have an avatar Jesus. Jews have a rabbi Jesus. Nice liberal pacifists have a nice liberal pacifist Jesus. Right. Fundamentalists have a fire and brimstone Jesus. So what I love about the mythic approach is actually it's a liberation from that, because once you see, as Joseph Campbell would say, that he is a mask of God, that he's a image through whom you can relate to the great mystery of existence, whatever you call that.
Yeah.
You should have your own Jesus. And Tim's Jesus should be different to Mark's Jesus, because he is an expression of your own deeper nature. So the fact that we're all relating different ones is just fine.
So it's a projection.
So indeed. And so ironically, the Gnostic approach allows people to keep their Jesus. And when pushed, most Christians will say to me, I go, why? Because most Christians haven't looked into history. If they did, they'd find there was none. But they just go, look, I know there's a Jesus because I relate to him in my heart. And that's actually a profound Gnostic sentiment.
Because it's personal.
It's personal.
Yeah.
It says nothing about history. You can't judge history based on what you feel in your heart.
Yeah.
But you can judge your spirituality in that way, and should.
Now, it's interesting. You say that you are asleep and dreaming. Wake up. Life is not what it seems. You are not who you think you are. What is your spiritual mission when you say that? Because it seems that you're making an appeal to regular people, even outside of, let's say, what you're writing. You're just trying to appeal to people with a spiritual message. What is that message?
Well, my main passion, my real passion is not history. It's kind of something we've done. But my passion is philosophy. And it's this philosophy of Gnosis, or waking up. Mm-hmm. And what I've done specifically in my little book, Lucid Living, which has got this great subtitle. It's called A Book You Can Read in an Hour That Will Turn Your World Inside Out. And it's a very short little book.
Okay.
Designed to encapsulate the essence of these ideas in a way that aren't religious, aren't really spiritual. They're just about, hey, what's this? What's this moment now we're experiencing? And how can we see into what we really are? And what I suggest is that, and this is based on what human beings have said for thousands of years, is nothing new, but hopefully it's a new way of saying it, is that there's a state which often gets called waking up, but it's like lucid dreaming, except now. It's like, that's why I call it lucid living.
Yeah.
In a normal dream, you're unconscious, aren't you? You think the dream's real.
Yeah.
You think you are who you appear to be in the dream. And if you dream lucidly, you dream consciously. And you recognize then that really, although you're appearing to be this person in the dream, really that's not all that you are, because you're the dreamer. You're the awareness within which the whole dream is arising. And in that sense, you are everyone and everything.
So you're not just a character in the play, you're directing it in a sense.
Exactly. You're the author, as we say in the Gospel of the Second Coming.
Right.
These ancient teachings, it's the same now. It really is. And if we look, I think it's quite easy to see it in a way which most people are surprised by, that right now, this moment is also arising within one awareness. And when we see that, it's like lucid dreaming, except it's now, that there's this one mind, if you like, within which everything is being created or imagined.
Yeah, I was curious as well, who have been some other big influences in your spiritual life? I know Alan Watts was a big influence. Was there any particular author or even kind of moment in your life that led you to where you're at now in terms of your own awakening?
Well, really, Mark, it's kind of started before I'd had any influences. For me, it started spontaneously when I was 12 years old. I used to feel that the whole of the adult world was entering into some sort of conspiracy, where everyone was pretending that they understood what was going on, they knew what life was, and nobody did. And that's my general experience still. Everyone's busily pretending they know who they are and what's going on. And
personas.
But actually, nobody really does know what's going on. It's incredibly mysterious. And one day when I was sitting on this hill thinking about these things as a kid, something happened. The world kind of turned inside out, and I was this big empty space, and there was all this love, this huge, all-embracing oneness and love. And I knew something very significant had happened. I don't know how long it lasted, probably not very long, I can't really remember.
Right.
I came down from the hill and carried on being an average teenager, but I knew that I was looking to understand that and to refine that, and have spent the rest of my life one way or other looking for what that experience and to enter it again, and to find ways of helping other people to enter into it, because it transforms life so profoundly in a positive way.
When you talk about something that is so mysterious, how do you, knowing yourself that you're sort of on the bar or off the bar? There's a lot of people that are very interested in Eastern ideas.
Yes.
But it's a very complex thing. There's a lot of simple spiritual messages there, but for a lot of people, they don't know how to enter into that. And so, what would be your advice to somebody that is conscious of some kind of mystery in their life, but they don't know how to go about entering into it in sort of a deeper way?
Well, that's what motivates me to write these books, whether it's the Little Lucid Living book or indeed the Gospel of the Second Coming. Just to enlarge on that allegory just for a second, because it will help people to understand what that book's really about, is that here's a book in which Jesus himself is saying, look, I don't really exist. I'm a character in a story. And talking to his disciples and saying, you don't really exist either. Your character's in the story. And when I'm speaking, it's really the author speaking. Everything is happening in the mind of the author. And his purpose, of course, is to convey to the reader, the same is true for them, that we are like characters in this story of life. And there's one author, there's one imagination within which that's arising. And the purpose is to convey that. Now, actually, that's a big but very simple idea. Seeing, for instance, if I look right now and saying, look, just like in a dream, I've got two natures right now. I'm an object and I'm a subject.
Right.
Here's the object, nice and obvious.
Yeah.
Here's I'm relating to you, and you appear as another object. But actually what I'm relating to in you isn't an object. It's awareness itself. And I can't see that. And I can't touch it. I know it's there, behind those shapes and forms, but where is it? It looks like it's in your head, but if I had a zip in your head and had a look inside and, could a magnifying glass, I'd never find it.
Okay.
It's not in there. So where is it? Well, I think what happens if you pay attention, you find it's the other way around. That awareness is the emptiness within which the forms are arising.
Okay.
So what we are isn't in the dream. What we are isn't in the story. What we are is this big empty presence. And once you let go of holding your identity to this limited thing and let it just, then that's the beginning of coming to this lucid living or gnosis.
Right, because you can, in essence, connect with everything else. You don't see it as separate from you.
Exactly. So it's kind of separate and not separate. Here we're definitely separate. As objects, there's, we're different. That's the way it is.
Sure.
But here, we're not. And you see that our nature has this polarity to it. Now, that's kind of two and one at the same time, if you like. So, any polarity, left, right.
Like a dualism.
They're opposites, yes.
Yeah.
But they're not just opposites, because you can't have left without right. They're also one. Yeah. And the same with our identities.
So you're saying there's an apparent contradiction on the surface, but if you go beyond, there's a oneness.
The two coexist in the moment. And the secret to finding them is it's just about looking now and freeing yourself from your suppositions, putting everything on hold, stepping out of the story into the mystery is the way that Jesus puts it in the Second Coming.
Yeah.
He constantly wants you to come out, and as you come out into the mystery, because I don't know about you, Mark, but most people, and I include myself, we go about our daily life, again, lost in a story of ourselves and what life is. But if something happens to wake you up from that, if you face death or you fall in love or just anything which wakes you up, most people have had that moment where suddenly they see the reality, and the reality is this breathtaking mystery of existence. That we are, that this is just an awesome mystery.
What would be, in terms of somebody watching this, somebody that's inspired by these ideas, what would maybe you want them to come away with in just a very simple way?
Everybody's coming at it from a different angle. So the universal message has to be more general, and the universal message for me is, look, this moment is far, far more mysterious than our ideas about it can possibly grasp. There is a state of waking up in which you can know for yourself what you are directly, and it's an experience that I would describe as oneness and love, and it brings life to life.
Right, and it's not separate from regular everyday life.
Far from it. What it does is makes you see how every moment is amazing, so that they can see we don't need to get stuck in religion, definitely. We don't really need to get to, this whole spiritual thing can become another thing you get caught up in.
Yeah.
What we're looking for is a direct realization of who we are and what this is, and that is just available to us if we pay attention.
Live at Open Secret Bookstore right now.
The easiest way to get this stuff about the Jesus story is like it's full of parables. Well, the whole thing's a parable. That's probably the quickest way into it. It's a teaching story, and it's a profound and deep one. Get the meaning of the story, that's the point. Now, it's a complex parable, and I'm not going to go into the whole thing. Heaven and hell for the Gnostics are here and now. So if you're living on the surface, you are in hell. It's hell because it's lonely. It's hell because you're going to suffer and die. Your body is going to corrupt. It's hell because you're going to go, what's in it for me? And that will create chaos all around you. And not only is it hell for you, but it's hell for everyone around you. I mean, geez, you'd be around someone who's just caught up in the separateness, and it's just horrendous. But come back inside yourself, find the Christ within you, find this common center where you're one with everything, and it becomes heaven. If you identify just with your superficial appearance, if you think you are just the separate person you appear to be, you are dead to who you really are. What do we need to do? We need to resurrect. We need to come back to life. So look, the death and resurrection is dying to identification with the separate self, the eidolon, and waking up or resurrecting, coming to life as what you really are, which is this presence right now, which is witnessing the whole thing. If we come deeply enough into that, that's Gnosis.
Welcome to Blue Honey Radio. I am Andrew, and this is episode number 2 of the Lost Interviews. Timothy Freke is a philosopher, author, and public speaker. His co-author, Peter Gandy, holds a master's degree in classical civilization, and he's an expert in classical mythology. I wanted Peter to start things off by talking about the importance of understanding actual history when dealing with mythology.
Is there any history in the Jesus story? I would say there are historical characters in the Jesus story. For example, Pontius Pilate is an historical character. Herod is an historical character. But what the creators of the Jesus story have done is use historical characters to weave into their fictional narrative about a God-man who comes to Jerusalem. And it would be like saying, well, Ben-Hur has various emperors and various people who really historically existed, but Ben-Hur himself is a fictional character. So I think although there are historical elements in it, the vast majority is myth.
For me, the hype is all about discovering the Christ consciousness within you, this cosmic Christ within. But the techniques for discovering this Christ within have almost been lost. It's as if the truth has become a myth, and then that myth has become truth. Peter Gandy explains.
That would place the Gospels 40 years after Paul's letters. But in the New Testament, it's put the other way around. So you get the Gospel stories first, and then Paul's letters. When you come to Paul, you automatically think that the Jesus Christ that he's talking about is the Jesus Christ you've just been reading about in the Gospels. And it took scholars quite a few centuries before they went and investigated Paul. What does he actually say about this Jesus figure? And what's amazing is that if you investigate Paul's original letters, his real letters, because there are quite a few forgeries in the New Testament, he makes no historical mention of a Jesus at all. In fact, when he comes to talk about the great secret that's been stored up from the beginning of time that he's going to reveal to his listeners, he doesn't say it's that Jesus was born down the road in a shed and he's the son. He says the secret is this: Christ in you. So for Paul, if you read his letters, you will construct a cosmic Jesus Christ who never had any existence.
And I think the most telling of all is Paul clearly says he met a vision of light.
Yeah.
We simply have this figure that you die and resurrect with, and then you discover the Christ within. And that's the message of the Gnostic Christians who don't believe in an historical Jesus. And it's also the message of the ancient mysteries, where the same figure was called by different names, but was essentially also someone that you mystically died and resurrected, or you come back to life with or through. And there's an element then of belief.
And I think we all go through this on the spiritual journey. The first thing you do is you look to somebody else, and you have a figure, and Jesus is a wonderful figure through whom people can communicate with the mystery of existence, God, whatever name you give to it. So that the Christ is the Gnostics' way of talking about what the ancient pagans called the Osiris within, or the Dionysus within, and it's that thing we all call I. And the great mystical revelation is there's one of us. If you come into the deepest place, there's just one of us. And the Christian mysteries, like the pagan mysteries, was all about discovering that essential oneness.
Absolutely. Like Paul says, we are all parts of one body. He's using the Christ thing. He says we are all parts of the body of Christ. And it's this idea that we share an essential oneness. But you come into it through separateness. Everybody arrives at the beginning as a separate individual.
Okay, but that still leaves the legend that we all know. The story of Jesus, born under a star in a manger. But what about the legend?
I love celebrating Christmas. Well, like all these stories and myths and fairy tales, there's something which engages with the imaginary mind. How lovely, especially when you have children, it's much easier, to have a thing where you're full of, a Christmas tree and it's all sparkling and there's gifts and time stops. This myth, I remember I see my children do the nativity story, and it's beautiful because it's very old, it's a very beautiful story. I don't have a problem with any of that. I'm very pro all of that. You see, I would like to see the whole of religion become like a cultural artifact. It's kind of our heritage. So we're not in it anymore. And then when we're free from it, we can take the good bits and leave the bad bits. Let's take love your enemies. Fantastic. There's a lot of stuff in there, just wonderful, challenging, deep stuff. But we can leave the gnashing of teeth. We don't need that anymore. No. And it's that ability to take what works and leave behind. That's what the evolution of culture is. But you don't abandon the past, all the beautiful music and the buildings and the traditions. We just see it differently. The question we get a lot is, there must have been a Jesus, because how else would this have happened, that this religion would have taken over the world? Someone had to start it, and of course someone did. And there's a huge amount of wisdom put into the mouth of Jesus, and somebody wrote that, somebody said that. What we're saying is that it wasn't the figure in the story that said that, anymore. That it wasn't Hamlet who said all those beautiful words, it was Shakespeare. But there was still someone behind it, and it is work of genius. And to just see how things spread without a founder, you've only got to look at Mithraism. If it hadn't been for the quirk that Constantine became a Christian, we could all probably now be discussing, was there a real Mithras? Because Mithraism was a huge cult across the whole of the ancient world.
The biggest.
Just massive. But we don't go looking for a real Mithras. Yeah. What I love about the approach that we've taken, though, is it doesn't diminish Christianity. Actually, it brings it to life. It goes, this is even more important than we thought, because it's actually about each one of us discovering who we really are.
And also, when you connect it with its ancient sources, you don't have a story which is, this story's been beguiling the West for 2,000 years. But when you realise that it's a continuation of pagan stories and that they go back into ancient Egypt, the Osiris legend comes to us right in the earliest pyramids, 2,500 years BC. They were telling the same story. So it really is the greatest story ever told. It comes as a revelation to people today. That Mithras was born on the 25th of December. It's like, well, hang on, that's Jesus' birthday. It was well before Jesus, there was Mithras, and it's the same story.
It's always an interesting exercise to break through your cultural conditioning, and I'm going to offer you that opportunity today with our guests, Timothy Freke and Peter Gandy. They're back with more information on the ancient Gnostics. Your book, The Jesus Mysteries, has been out for some time and now in paperback, and I find some of the comments coming in, even from the Bible Belt, this comment from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, whether you conclude that this book is the most alarming heresy of the millennium, or the mother of all revelations, The Jesus Mysteries deserves to be read. What kind of reaction have you had thus far?
Had some great reviews from other scholars. But more importantly, I think we've had great support from ordinary readers and a lot of people who felt they were stuck in Christianity. A lot of fundamentalists email us with messages saying, I was stuck in this for 20 years, I knew there was something wrong, and then finally I feel free. And the joy which comes across in these emails is just immense, the sense of freedom, the sense of new possibilities. The only sadness is that sometimes they feel like their old friends won't talk to them anymore. And this is the sadness, of course, of fundamentalism. It's a closed thing, you're either in or you're out. So people who wake up from that mindset and suddenly see new possibilities are often thrown out. So that's the sadness. But apart from that, there's great joy. And we do get hostility. We haven't received any death threats, but we've received an awful lot of after-death threats. If some fundamentalists are to be believed, then Jesus and God have got a little torture chamber set up specifically for Peter and I to get even with us for eternity, which kind of shows the sort of God that you end up with when you've got a fundamentalist mindset, who do that. It's certainly not the God that I think the original Christians had, who was very much a God of love and forgiveness.
But it's always a sign of their own insecurity. We've had people come up to us at bookshop when we're doing talks, and they are quaking. I mean, they are literally shaking. They are profoundly convinced of the truth of the literal Jesus and all the rest of it, and this cuts right to the core of their own being. Those people who are able to say, oh, I see, yeah, it's a myth, like all the other myths, I get it, are generally relaxed and able to open up their own boundaries. And what you begin to realize is that a lot of people's open-mindedness is to do with their beginning in life. If you're filled with fear, then you're not able to open up to these new possibilities.
But you don't just take away a historical Jesus. You guys put back a truly spiritual quest and message.
The teachings that the Christians want to encode in this story is about freeing you from your mindset. We're all walking around in an idea of what life is, an idea of who we are, and they want to set us free into the genuine mystery of existence, into realizing what a mystery it is that we are, the one miracle that anything is at all. On the one hand, we have literalists, what we call literalists, people who take all of this literally. Their books are literally written by God. This is the fundamentalist mindset. But on the other hand, there's what we call Gnostics, or mystics. And what marks out the mystics is the opposite, that they don't take it literally. They regard it all about waking up to a revelation of what's happening in this moment. All their teachings and their scriptures are fingers pointing to something, not the thing in itself.
And it's a direct route to God. It's between you and God directly, not you through your community or your tribal identity or your particular religion.
And to an experience that can't be put into words. So therefore, any words you use to define it, God, Allah, whatever are secondary. They're after the fact.
So what you've got is, on the one hand, what you could call religion, and on the other hand, you could call mysticism or Gnosticism. And religion, actually, I mean, we come out in the new book and just say it boldly at the end, but mythically I'm speaking now, not literally, of course, but religion is the work of the devil. We say religion is the devil's greatest achievement, because what it does is divide us from each other. Whereas what mysticism is about, the original impulse, it's all about unity. It's all about, and what you notice about the Gnostics, and it's from this Gnostic spirit that Christianity is born, is that it sees no divisions. So they all agree with each other. Pagan Gnostics, Jewish Gnostics, agree with each other. They're seeing the same vision. There's no division between them. They can draw on each other's
text. Because you see it as variations on the same thing.
Precisely. And this is why they, and only they, are able to synthesize pagan and Jewish ideas to create Christianity, because they don't see any division between them. Because what they're looking for is the truth, something which goes way beyond all these divisions. But the other extreme, the religious people, these are the people there, the mystics are attacking and trying to free up. They see all those divisions. They are the people who want to mark us all out as different to each other. And that's the fundamentalist mindset. And what they're doing is they're defending themselves from their fear of the mystery, with this mindset. And what the Gnostics are saying is, it's okay, the mystery isn't frightening. You can let go of all of that armor plating, conceptual armor plating, and surrender into life, because life will catch you. It's safe.
Trust the process.
Trust the process. You don't need to be frightened. So when Pete says we have these young fundamentalists often come up shaking, then I found the best thing to do is give them a hug and just go, it's okay, because they're only fundamentalists because they're fundamentally frightened. Well, if they can see that life is not, that life is okay, that it's fundamentally good, then there's no need for that armor plating.
Is it a particular personality type? I mean, I look at the mystery and I feel the breath of it, feel the wind of it flow through your hair, and I'm just going, oh yeah, I like that. Is that the experience that scares other people, or is it just a different personality type? Is it a psychological thing? Is it the way you were raised? Is it...
Well, I think the intriguing thing is, if you say to a fundamentalist, say a fundamentalist Christian, as we have done, look, if you were born in Algeria or Iraq and you were brought up in a Muslim culture, do you really think you would be a Christian now? Or do you think you would be a fundamentalist Islamic? Because actually it's the mindset that is the same, and the set of beliefs that it will jump onto can be anything. Fundamentalists are people who are stuck in a mindset who think that is literally how it is. They can't step back enough from their ideas to go, well, of course, these are just my ideas. Yeah, but people cling to these things like they have so much invested in, and often, it's especially true, I think, with spiritual awakening, is that it is something quite shocking. Suddenly the world's not enough, there has to be something else, what have you. Once you have found this thing, once you've made this awakening, you can go on to a further awakening, but only by letting go of this one thing that you're clinging to.
The light's brighter down, the time will keep going.
Keep going, absolutely.
Yeah, there's definitely a phenomenon, I think, most people would, where if you have an awakening experience of any type at all, you do, as Pete's saying, if you happen to be in a Christian environment, you go, aha, it's Christianity. But it isn't, it's just awakening. Happens to be through that. You have to find out what it is in itself. But people
That's when your inner voice starts kicking in and leads you to the next step if you'll listen.
Yeah, it wasn't
You know,
Jesus, or was it?
I have a real firm scientist friend, big believer in Tesla. I'm looking for the energy, the subtle energies and all of this from a scientific mindset. And he called me up one day and he said, God, I had an experience where I imbibed this and it just woke me up in a way. And he went and joined a Christian fundamentalist cult because he said, well, they've got the, they know how to embody and take the Holy Spirit inside of them and deal with it. So he wanted to go explore that. And I've never heard from him since.
One of the great problems we've got, and I think it's an area that we want to move into, and now we've worked specifically with Christianity, is that what's happening culturally is that we're distinguishing religion from spirituality, I think, and that's partly what we're doing in the second book, Jesus and the Lost Goddess, is going, look, we need to understand what this spirituality is. And the future seems to be one in which we're becoming secular, we're seeing the power of science. Science differentiated itself from religion, and it's been immensely good for us. It's been very powerful. It's given us all of this. And yet there's danger of losing something, you're losing spirituality, and people aren't willing to do that. People adjust the spiritual narrative, other than perhaps more so. But I think there is a feeling that people don't want religion. And what we were pointing to, this essence, this gnosis, is what the Christians call the gospel of gnosis, the good news of enlightenment, you could call it. This is about states of being. This is about discovering for yourself what is, what you are. And that doesn't have anything to do with religion. So if we can differentiate that, and make that available, then people won't be in the position that when they awaken, they have to go, oh God, where can I get some advice on this? Well, I'll go to my local church and just put up with whatever they're given. But they've actually got the options of doing it in a new way, doing it in a way that suits them.
And I think historically that's been the process, is that with the Enlightenment, which was only achieved after huge bloodshed in Europe, the Reformation I'm talking about now, the Protestants and the Catholics, and out of that, the wars of religion, came the Enlightenment, when most people just went, no, we've had enough of religion. It's caused so much trouble, that's it. And so, with Voltaire and everybody after him, religion has had a dirty name. And what happened, I think, was the Enlightenment threw the baby out with the bathwater. They threw all of that away. And so science, which developed then, has come with a very bleak, materialistic viewpoint. We're just monkeys who came down out of trees completely accidentally. We're clinging to a rock, hurtling through meaningless space. And it's a very bleak picture.
But that's not our personal experience.
But that's not our personal experience. And what we're trying to do is to say, look, you threw away all of religion with the Enlightenment, but actually spirituality is the valuable thing that's in there. And the extraordinary thing is that none of the scientists who've made the whole scientific endeavor possible were actually materialists themselves.
They were all mystics.
Newton and Kepler and Einstein, and you could go on and on and on. They were all out and out mystics.
I love reviving what the Gnostics knew. I've always been curious if that's been cut off, if the Roman Empire did such a good job of bearing that whole wisdom tradition. It's nice to have it restructured where we can look at it again and give it its rightful place in spiritual options.
Love is the most truthful and beautiful feeling that a human being can have. And I think anyone who experiences that knows that. You can't miss that. You just know that. But that's what you should do. That's what you want to feel. It's when you recognize that oneness with one person, a crowd of people, the universe, as much as you can. And that's why the gospel, the good news that the Gnostics are teaching, is love. It's the idea of loving your enemies, loving your neighbors. God is love. You hear it.
Because you're at the stance where it's all one.
Where it's all one. Yeah.
And you recognize
we are one thing exploring its
and once you recognize that, you behave very differently.
You behave very differently, and you're living in a miracle. You're living in this, you're no longer living in your mindset, to go back to the beginning of our conversation.
In your true companionship.
You're in the mystery. You're in the mystery of love. You're on a mystic journey in the mystery of love, as well as going through exactly the same life that you've always been going through.
Chop wood, carry water, the same thing, but your interior experience of it is much more expansive.
You just know how miraculous it is to chop wood and carry water.
Going back in history, was there a time, do you suppose, you see the evidence of it, where the Gnostics had the majority mindset going on, where these were practiced, where laws and institutions were based upon this understanding?
Oh, yeah.
And then let's talk later about how the Roman Empire really tried to squash this and bury it, and then the Nag Hammadi and other indications. It's all springing from the same source that will flower.
It springs up all over the place, and it's flourished throughout history. There have been moments when it really comes to the surface. I think one of those great flowerings was the Renaissance itself in Florence. You can go back before that. The Cathars in southern France and northern Italy created the troubadour culture, fabulously wealthy and a high culture. But again, these things have been viciously destroyed. You can go back again to Alexandria, for example, or before that in classical Athens, times when it's flourished. But sadly, there has always been a reactionary backlash against those forces of freeing the spirit, because that's what you see, is wherever the spirit is freed, there is a magnificent cultural flowering. But that represents a definite threat to other people who
want to lord it over the rest of us?
Well, you don't have the control. I mean, the whole thing about Gnosticism versus literalism. Gnosticism is very much finding your own personal relationship with the cosmos, with whatever you conceive God to be. But organized religion is no, you can only find access to God through us, the priests, through us, the church. And it's very much about establishing control. You look at times in ancient Egypt where it was a theocracy. It was a place run by priests. Now, for occasional periods, that was fantastic. But for a lot of the time, the reason why ancient Egypt didn't change was because it was run by priests. And once you have an absolute story that is absolutely true, and
stops growing and
it stops growing. Yeah. Now, then there was a period when the Greeks were in control of the Mediterranean. There was no organized priesthood. There was no organized body of texts that were the sacred texts. There was nobody enforcing a religious orthodoxy. And there was a tremendous flowering. All of the cultures that bordered the Mediterranean contributed to their own, and Alexandria in ancient Egypt was a fantastic place where some Pythagoreans and Jews and all sorts mingled and mixed and created a fabulous culture. But eventually that succumbed to the same process that had happened in ancient Egypt. A theocracy arose, priests who were controlling the law, what could be and could not be believed, and out of that came the Holy Roman Empire, the Christian Church, with priests in control, and what happened in Europe was 1,000 years of dark ages. Nothing happened. Nothing changed, because nothing could change. There was no possibility. Only with the Renaissance, as I've said, with the introduction of other ways of looking at the world, could the possibility of comparative mythology, comparative religion, open things up for people. And
similar to what's happening today.
Exactly.
Everything's available right now. We know more. We can look back in history. We can look at the evidence. We can use forensic.
And just, and just as we're seeing the rise of fundamentalism, which opposes that, which sees that as something that dilutes the character of it, because it's very nationalistic, usually, as well. It's seen as something which is weakening the culture or corrupting it in some way. What it's actually doing is creating amazing new combinations. I mean, I love it. But there are people who want things to be just so and just under control.
I love the diversity and the party of it, and the dance and the exploration, and let's compare notes. And
clearly the one wants to be many in as many possible ways as it can. I mean, that seems to be obvious if you just look around you. It wants that variety. It wants to experiment in all directions. But it doesn't want to hurt itself. And that's simply which gives rise to that ethic of, well, don't hurt others. It's a way of going, look, we're one thing, we don't hurt ourselves. And that's what we must avoid doing. But apart from that, within that, then we need the more freedom, the more creativity.
We've talked to some of the members of the Jesus Seminar, and we've talked to other researchers who are suggesting that the new body of research shows that Jesus had a twin brother named Thomas, that he married Mary Magdalene. Where are these details?
Well, I think let's start with Jesus' twin brother.
Okay.
Because the Gospel of Thomas opens with Jesus saying to his twin brother, Thomas, for the Gnostics, every single one of us is Jesus' twin.
Oh, it's a metaphor.
Because they are a higher self.
Because their goal was to awaken the Christ within us.
Exactly. And again, because we can't escape from this literalism, we assume, and some people have said, well, nobody would create the story of Jesus' twin. It must be true because,
there it is in black and white.
And there's a simple explanation for the resurrection. Jesus was killed, but his twin survived, and everybody thought, it's a miracle. It's all literalism. All of the characters in the story, Mary Magdalene and the disciples, they're all there to explore these ideas.
Thank you so much, and it is so good to have this ancient wisdom tradition back on the surface where we can enjoy it, learn from it, delve deep into it, come to appreciate its message.